The sharp metallic scent of salt spray mingles with the deep earthy aroma of damp pine needles and crushed moss. Imagine, if you will, the sound of a heavy wooden hull gently knocking against a stone pier, a rhythmic hollow thud that echoes softly through a valley carved by ice and time. This is the edge of the known world, a place where the mountains do not merely rise but seem to surge upward from the dark, frigid depths of the North Sea. The fjords of Scandinavia are ancient cathedrals of rock and water, winding narrow paths of glass-calm sea that reach deep into the heart of the land, flanked by cliffs so high they seem to hold up the heavy, grey curtains of the sky. In the early morning, a thick silver mist clings to the water's surface, blurring the line between the liquid world and the solid earth, creating a silent, ethereal realm where the only sound is the distant, haunting cry of a sea eagle or the slow drip of melting snow from a high granite ledge. The landscape of the north is one of harsh, breathtaking beauty, a geography defined by its extremes and its quiet, enduring strength. To the west, the jagged coastline of Norway breaks into 1,000 islands and deep-veined inlets, while to the east, the vast forests of Sweden and the rolling plains of Denmark offer a different kind of sanctuary. It is a land of long, luminous summers, where the sun barely brushes the horizon before rising again, and even longer, starlit winters, where the darkness is absolute and the air is so cold it feels brittle, like thin glass. Yet, within this rugged terrain, life found a way to take root and flourish in the small, fertile pockets of land tucked between the mountains and the sea. The people of these northern reaches were not born as raiders, but as farmers, shepherds, and craftsmen who understood the delicate rhythm of the seasons and the demanding nature of the soil. Life centered around the longhouse, a sturdy communal structure built of timber, turf, and stone that served as the beating heart of the Norse settlement. These buildings were long and low, designed to withstand the fierce winds that swept down from the glaciers, with roofs that often resembled the upturned hulls of the very ships they would one day build. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the smell of peat smoke and roasted grain. A central hearth ran down the middle of the single vast room, providing light and heat while casting long, flickering shadows against the tapestries and shields that lined the wooden walls. Here, families lived together in a close communal embrace. Children played in the rushes on the floor, elders told stories by the fire, and the steady hum of the loom provided a constant backdrop to the daily chores of survival. As you settle into your blankets and find a comfortable position for the night, perhaps you are feeling the same sense of quiet peace that those early settlers felt when the day's work was done. If you are finding comfort in these stories, I invite you to join us here at the Slumber Archives. We share new history narrations just like this one every single day, crafted to help you drift into a deep and restful sleep. If you enjoy our journey through time, please consider subscribing so you never miss a night of exploration, and a gentle like on this video helps others find their way to our quiet corner of the world. But for now, let us return to the shadows of the Longhouse and the mysteries of the Northern Mist. The connection between the Norse people and their land was not merely one of survival, but one of deep spiritual resonance. They did not see the mountains, the forests, or the rivers as inanimate objects, but as living entities inhabited by spirits and governed by ancient forces. The earth itself was a sacred tapestry, woven with the presence of the hidden folk, the Landvatir, who protected the farms and required respect and offerings to ensure a good harvest. Every grove of trees had its own memory, and every rushing waterfall carried the voice of something much older than humanity. This was a world where the veil between the physical and the divine was thin, and the gods were not distant figures in a far-off heaven, but neighbors who walked among the clouds and the thunder. At the center of this spiritual world stood the early Norse pantheon, a collection of deities who reflected the ruggedness and complexity of the environment. There was Odin, the All-Father, a wanderer and a seeker of wisdom who sacrificed an eye for a draught from the well of knowledge, a god of poetry, war, and the runes who moved through the world like a shadow. Beside him was Thor, the protector of mankind, whose hammer blows were heard in the rolling thunder of a summer storm, and whose strength was as reliable as the bedrock beneath their feet. And then there were the Vanir, gods like Freya and Freya, who oversaw the fertility of the earth and the abundance of the sea, ensuring that the crops grew and the livestock thrived through the brief, intense growing season. These early Scandinavians understood that they existed at the mercy of the elements, and their faith was a way of negotiating with the wild. They looked to the stars and the flight of birds for omens, believing that the Norns, the three sisters of fate, sat at the roots of the world tree, Yggdrasil, weaving the threads of every life into a grand, unbreakable pattern. To live well was to accept one's place in that weaving, to face the cold with courage and the harvest with gratitude. As the years passed, this deep-seated resilience and their intimate knowledge of the sea began to pull them further from their shores. The narrow fjords that had once been their entire world were becoming the gateways to a vast, watery horizon. The transition from farmer to voyager was a slow, natural progression, born of necessity and curiosity. The land was beautiful, but it was also limited, and as populations grew, the young and the restless began to look toward the grey expanse of the North Sea with new eyes. They possessed a unique understanding of woodcraft, learned from generations of building longhouses that could withstand the weight of winter snows, and they applied this knowledge to the construction of vessels that were both light and incredibly strong. These early boats were the precursors to the legendary longships, designed to flex with the waves rather than fight against them, allowing the Norsemen to navigate the shallowest rivers and the deepest oceans with equal grace. And so the quiet life of the fjord began to change. The rhythm of the plough was joined by the rhythmic dip of the oar. The mist that had once served as a protective shroud for their homes now became a cloak for their departures as they set out into the unknown, guided by the stars and the ancient stories of their ancestors. They carried with them their gods, their traditions, and the indomitable spirit of the North, ready to write a new saga that would echo across the centuries. But even as they sailed toward distant lands and legendary fame, the memory of the still, dark water of the fjord and the warmth of the longhouse fire remained anchored in their hearts, a reminder of the quiet, moss-covered world where it all began.
Imagine the sound of a rhythmic hammer striking a wooden peg into a plank of seasoned oak. This was the heartbeat of the Viking world, the steady, patient pulse that echoed through the coastal forests and the sheltered coves of the north. To understand the Viking, one must first understand the vessel that carried their dreams across the salt spray and the foam. The longship was more than a means of transport. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a living creature of wood and iron that breathed with the movement of the waves. The secret of these legendary ships lay in a technique known as clinker building. Unlike the heavy, rigid hulls of southern Europe, the Norse shipbuilders layered their planks so that they overlapped, like the feathers on a bird's wing or the scales of a great sea serpent. These thin, flexible strakes of oak were fastened together with iron rivets, creating a hull that was remarkably light and incredibly strong. When the ship met the heavy swells of the North Atlantic, it did not fight the ocean, it moved with it. The entire frame would flex and twist, absorbing the energy of the water, allowing the vessel to dance over the crests rather than crashing through them. It is said that a sailor could watch the gunwales of his ship bend as much as several inches in a storm, a sight that might terrify a landsman. But to the Viking, it was the sign of a ship that would not break. The wood itself was chosen with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. Shipwrights would wander through the deep forests, searching for oaks with natural curves that matched the lines of a ship's ribs or the sharp arc of the prow. By using the natural grain of the wood, they ensured that the strength of the tree remained intact within the vessel. This marriage of nature and craft meant that the longship drew very little water. It could glide into shallow estuaries and slide onto sandy beaches where no other ship of its size dared to go, appearing out of the morning mist like a ghost and vanishing just as quickly into the grey horizon. As the ship took shape, its identity was forged in the carving of the prow. Here, the Norsemen placed the dragonhead, a fierce and snarling beast intended to ward off the malevolent spirits of the sea and to strike a silent, chilling awe into the hearts of those on distant shores. These prows were often removable, taken down when the ship returned home, so as not to frighten the protective land spirits of their own fjords. Behind the dragon's head rose the single, towering mast, supporting a vast square sail made of heavy wool, often reinforced with leather strips to help it hold its shape against the biting winds. When the wind caught that sail, dyed in deep reds or striped with natural creams and browns, the ship became a bird of prey, capable of speeds that were unmatched in its time. But even the finest ship is a hollow shell without the wisdom to guide it across the trackless wastes of the open sea. The Vikings possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of the natural world, a knowledge passed down through generations of observation and story. They did not have the magnetic compasses of later centuries, yet they navigated with a precision that seems almost supernatural today. They watched the flight of birds, knowing that certain species never strayed far from land. They tasted the saltiness of the water and noted the color of the sea, recognizing the subtle shifts that indicated a change in depth or a nearby current. They listened to the sounds of the waves, distinguishing the deep roar of the open ocean from the sharp, rhythmic slap of water hitting a hidden reef. When the clouds gathered and the horizon vanished into a blur of grey, they turned to the legendary sunstones. These were crystals of Iceland's spar, a clear mineral that had the curious property of polarizing light. Even on a day so overcast that the sun was entirely hidden from view, a navigator could hold the stone up to the sky and rotate it until the light intensified, revealing the exact position of the sun behind the veil of clouds. It was a bridge between the seen and the unseen, a way to find one's path when all logic suggested they were lost in the void. At night, when the air grew cold and the spray turned to ice on the rigging, they looked to the stars of the northern sky. They knew the steady glow of the North Star, the unmoving point around which the rest of the heavens revolved. They followed the Great Bear and the wandering paths of the planets, weaving the movements of the celestial bodies into the same sagas that told of their gods. To a Viking navigator, the sky was a map written in light, and the ocean was a familiar road, provided one knew how to read the signs left by the wind and the tide. And so, the longship became a vessel of destiny, a perfect harmony of oak, iron, and ancient wisdom. Within its narrow hull, 30 or 40 men would sit side by side on their sea chests, their shields hung over the sides to provide a glimmering wall of protection against the spray. They shared the salt air, the rhythmic pull of the oars, and the quiet anticipation of what lay beyond the next swell. There was a profound silence in those moments of crossing, a silence broken only by the creak of the timber and the sigh of the wind in the sail. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a long golden path across the water, the men would settle into their furs, the dragon at the prow leading them ever onward into the unknown, toward lands that existed only in the whispers of travellers and the dreams of the bold. The engineering of the ship was not merely for speed or for war, it was built for the endurance of the human spirit. The flexibility of the oak allowed them to survive the terrifying gales of the North Sea, while the shallow draught allowed them to explore the winding rivers of the east, reaching as far as the black earth of the Rus and the golden domes of Miklagard. Every plank was a testament to a culture that did not fear the horizon, but rather saw it as an invitation. They were a people of the edge, living on the edge of the world, sailing on the edge of the waves, and constantly pushing the edges of what was thought possible. As the stars sharpened in the cold night air, the navigator would take his place at the steering oar, a large, heavy blade fixed to the starboard side of the ship. With a steady hand, he would feel the pulse of the ocean through the wood, adjusting the course by the tilt of the constellations. The ship was no longer just a construction of wood. It was an extension of the crew itself, a shared home that carried their history and their future across the deep, dark water. And in the quiet of the night, as the longship glided silhouetted against the moon, one could almost hear the timber whispering the stories of all the trees that had gone into its making and all the journeys that were yet to come. The scent of salt and old cedar often lingers in the memory long after the shore has been reached, a quiet reminder of the boundary between the known world and the vast, grey unknown. For many years, this boundary was a place of quiet exchange, where the rhythmic dip of oars meant the arrival of amber, fine furs, and whetstones from the rugged north. Trade was the steady heartbeat of the North Sea, a slow and deliberate conversation between cultures that spoke different tongues, but understood the universal language of silver and craft. But history has a way of turning upon a single morning, a moment when the mist clears to reveal a sight that changes the collective psyche of a continent forever. It was the 8th of June in the year 793, when the horizon off the coast of Northumbria offered up a vision that would haunt the dreams of the medieval world for centuries. The monks of Lindisfarne, living on their tidal island of prayer and illuminated manuscripts, looked out across the water to see the dragon-headed prows emerging from the haze. To them, the sea had always been a barrier of God's making, a protective moat around their sanctuary of peace. But on that day, the water became a highway for a force they could neither comprehend nor contain. As the longships ground against the shingle of the holy island, the silence of the monastery was broken by the sound of iron and the shouts of men who did not fear the saints. This was the raid on Lindisfarne, a strike so sudden and so brutal that it sent ripples of existential dread through the fragmented kingdoms of Europe. The Vikings did not come to occupy or to govern, not yet. They came like a summer storm, swift and devastating, taking the gold from the altars and the silver from the shrines, before vanishing back into the grey spray of the North Sea. To the scholars in the court of Charlemagne and the priests in the heart of Wessex, this was not merely a physical attack, it was a spiritual catastrophe. The Northmen were viewed not just as raiders, but as a divine scourge, a mysterious and terrifying people appearing from the edges of the map where the world was thought to end. The psychological effect of this sudden emergence cannot be overstated, for it shattered the fragile sense of security that the coastal people had built over generations. Before Lindisfarne, the sea was a source of life and a path for commerce, a predictable neighbour that brought the wealth of distant lands in exchange for the surplus of the harvest. But now, every sail seen on the distant horizon brought a tightening of the chest and a frantic glance toward the safety of the hills. The Northman became a shadow in the mind, a ghost story made of flesh and steel that could appear at any moment, driven by the tides and the wind. And yet, beneath the terror of the raids, there was a complex evolution taking place in the motivations of these seafaring people. In the early years of the Viking Age, the line between the merchant and the marauder was often as thin as a blade's edge. A Norse traveller might arrive at a coastal village with bundles of walrus ivory and dried fish, spending days in peaceful negotiation, only to return the following season with a shield wall and a hunger for plunder. This transition from trade to raid was born of a keen eye for opportunity. The Vikings were, above all else, master observers of the world around them. They noticed the wealth accumulating in the poorly defended monasteries of the coast, where gold was kept not behind stone walls and garrisoned gates, but behind the perceived protection of holy ground. As the years passed, the motivation for these voyages began to shift from simple survival and local prestige to something far more ambitious. The discovery of the riches of the West acted like a spark in a dry forest, drawing more and more young men away from the rocky farms of Scandinavia and toward the rolling waves. The pressure of a growing population and the desire for social standing meant that a successful voyage could transform a common farmer into a man of great influence. Silver was the lifeblood of their society, not just as a means of buying goods, but as a way of binding men together. A leader who could provide his followers with arm rings of twisted silver and fine weapons was a leader who could command loyalty unto death. Meanwhile, the kingdoms of Europe were ill prepared for this new kind of warfare. The world of the late 8th century was a patchwork of small, often warring territories, where power was localized and slow to mobilize. By the time a king could gather his fyrd or his knights to repel an invasion, the long ships were often already miles out at sea, their holds heavy with loot and their sails catching the evening breeze. The Vikings moved with a fluidity that the stationary kingdoms could not match, using the rivers of Europe like silver veins to reach deep into the heart of the land. They were the masters of the surprise arrival, appearing where they were least expected and disappearing before a counterattack could be organized. There is a certain melancholy in imagining the quiet evenings following those early raids, when the smoke of the watch-fires drifted over the cliffs and the people of the coast looked out at the empty water. The fear was not just of the violence itself, but of the unknown. The question of who these people were and what gods they served to make them so fearless of the divine wrath of the church. The sagas tell us of the Northmen's belief in fate, the idea that the threads of a man's life are spun and cut by the Norns, and that no amount of prayer can change what is already written. This fatalism gave them a terrifying calm in the heat of battle, a sense that their end was already decided, leaving them free to act with a ferocity that seemed almost supernatural to their victims. As the sun dipped below the horizon in those turbulent years, the Lindisfarne horizon remained a symbol of this new, uncertain reality. The world was larger than the monks had imagined, and far more dangerous. The sea, once a quiet companion to the rhythm of the tides, had revealed its teeth, yet even in this era of conflict, the seeds of a profound cultural exchange were being sown. The silver that flowed north would eventually bring back new ideas, new technologies, and a gradual blending of traditions that would reshape the very fabric of the North Sea world. The image of the Viking as a mindless destroyer is only a small fragment of the larger truth. Behind the shield was a person who valued the warmth of the hearth, the complexity of a well-told story, and the intricate beauty of a carved dragon. They were a people driven by a restless energy, a desire to see what lay beyond the next headland, and a belief that the world was a place of endless opportunity for those brave enough to seize it. And so, as the darkness of the Middle Ages deepened, the light of the Northmen began to burn brighter, a flickering flame on the distant waves that signaled the beginning of an age that would redefine the boundaries of the known world. In the quiet hours of the night, when the wind rattles the window pane and the house settles into its foundations, it is easy to imagine the sound of those ancient oars hitting the water in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The journey was long, the stars were the only map, and the destination was often nothing more than a hope for a better life or a name that would live forever in the songs of the poets. The Lindisfarne horizon was not just a place of ending, but a place of beginning, the threshold of a story that is still being told in the stones of the ruins and the whispers of the tide. The sound of a gavel striking a stone block is not what echoed through the valleys of Iceland, but rather the low, steady murmur of 1,000 voices carried on a cold wind. To understand the soul of the North, one must look past the dragon-headed ships and the glint of iron, and instead find the grassy plains of Thingvellir. Here, in a natural amphitheatre formed by the rift between tectonic plates, the air smells of crushed heather and damp basalt. This is the site of the Althing, a gathering that began in the year 930, where the law was not a dusty book locked in a scriptorium, but a living, breathing thing held in the collective memory of the people. Every summer, when the sun refused to dip below the horizon and the days stretched into a shimmering, eternal twilight, the various clans would travel for weeks across the rugged interior to reach this sacred assembly. They came to settle blood feuds, to trade news from distant shores, and most importantly, to listen to the law speaker. Standing upon the Lökberg, or the Law Rock, the law speaker held a position of immense prestige, yet he possessed no army and no crown. His power resided entirely in his mind. Before the arrival of the written word, he was required to memorize the entire legal code of the Commonwealth, reciting 1/3 of it every year to the gathered crowds. Imagine the scene, the vast silence of the valley as he speaks, his voice bouncing off the high stone walls of the Almanagja gorge, ensuring that the rules governing their society were known to every free man and woman. It was a remarkably democratic structure for its time, rooted in the belief that the law should be a shield for the weak as much as a tool for the strong. If a man was wronged, he did not always reach for his axe. He brought his case to the Thing, where a jury of his peers would weigh the evidence and deliver a verdict of fines or, in the most severe cases, outlawry. To be declared an outlaw was to be cast out of the warmth of the community, to become a man of the woods, a ghost wandering the fringes of a world that no longer recognized your name. While the law speaker held the threads of order, it was the skald who wove the tapestry of their history. In the dim light of the longhouse, where the peat fire smoulders and the smoke curls like grey ribbon around the rafters, the skald begins his performance. Unlike the simple rhymes we might know today, skaldic poetry was a complex architecture of sound built upon alliteration and a sophisticated system of metaphors known as kennings. A ship was not merely a boat. It was a sea steed or the skier of the waves. Gold was the fire of the sea, and battle was the clash of the Valkyries. These poets were the keepers of the North's collective memory, travelling from the courts of kings in Norway to the remote farmsteads of the Faroes. They did not just tell stories, they preserved the lineages of great families and the deeds of fallen heroes with such precision that their verses became historical records in their own right. The rhythm of the poetry is hypnotic, a steady, pulsing meter that mimics the heartbeat or the rhythmic pull of an oar through heavy water. As the skald speaks, the listeners are transported from their cold benches to the halls of Valhalla, or to the deck of a ship tossing in a midnight storm, the words acting as a bridge between the mundane world and the realm of the eternal. As the echoes of the poetry fade into the crackle of the fire, one begins to see the intricate layers of the society that produce such art. At the foundation of this world were the thralls, the enslaved men and women who performed the grueling labor that allowed the Viking age to flourish. They were the ones who tilled the heavy soil, who tended the livestock in the biting frost, and who ground the grain into flour. Their lives were often silent and shadowed in the historical record, yet their presence was the bedrock upon which the wealth of the Jarls was built. Above them were the carls, the free farmers and craftsmen who formed the vast majority of the population. These were the men who answered the call to go a Viking in the spring, but who returned in the autumn to harvest the barley and repair the thatch on their roofs. They were fiercely independent, tied to their land and their kin, and they walked with their heads high, knowing they had a voice at the local assembly. At the pinnacle of this hierarchy sat the Jarls, the noble chieftains who possessed the wealth to commission ships and the charisma to lead men into the unknown. A jarl's power was never absolute. It was a delicate balance of generosity and strength. He was a ring-giver, expected to distribute the spoils of his voyages to his followers, ensuring their loyalty through a constant flow of silver and silk. Within this structured world, the position of women was uniquely distinct from much of the rest of medieval Europe. While the public sphere of the Althing was largely a male domain, the threshold of the home was the undisputed territory of the Norse woman. When the men departed for months or even years at a time, it was the women who managed the vast estates, oversaw the production of textiles, and directed the defense of the farmstead. The symbol of her authority was the heavy bunch of keys hanging from her belt, a sign that she held the power over the storehouse and the hearth. Viking women possessed the right to own property in their own names, to claim an inheritance and, perhaps most significantly, the right to initiate a divorce. If a husband was unfaithful or failed to provide for the family, a woman could stand before her witnesses at the front door and at the assembly, declaring herself free of the marriage. There is a quiet strength in this image. A woman standing in the crisp morning air, her voice steady and clear, asserting her autonomy in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. As the years passed, these laws and social structures acted as the invisible glue holding together a civilization that was spread thin across the vast reaches of the North Sea. From the fjords of Scandinavia to the settlements in Greenland, the shared understanding of the law and the shared language of the Skalds created a sense of belonging that transcended geography. Even in the furthest reaches of the West, a traveller could find a longhouse where the same stories were told and the same codes of honour were respected. It is a world of contrasts, the rigid cold of the law and the fiery passion of the poetry, the heavy chains of the thrall and the soaring freedom of the jarl, and yet, beneath it all, there is a profound sense of continuity. The landscape of the north is one of constant change, where the glaciers move with glacial slowness and the volcanic earth can shift in a heartbeat, but the human spirit seeks stability in the stories it tells itself. The Althing was more than a court. It was a promise that even in a land of ice and fire there was a place for justice, a place for memory, and a place for the voice of the individual to be heard against the roaring of the wind. As the stars begin to peer through the clouds over the valley of Thingvellir, and the law speaker finishes his final recitation for the year, a deep peace settles over the gathering. The fires burn low, the horses graze quietly in the distance, and the laws of the people are once again woven into the very earth they stand upon, waiting for the next season, the next song, and the next horizon to be crossed. The sound of a sharpening stone against an iron blade is a rhythmic, steady pulse, a metallic whisper that echoes through the fog-shrouded encampments along the rivers of East Anglia. It is the year 865, and the nature of the Northman's presence in England is shifting, moving away from the fleeting shadows of coastal raids towards something far more permanent, far more heavy with the weight of destiny. For decades, the longships appeared like ghosts on the horizon, took what they desired, and vanished back into the grey mist of the North Sea. But now, the horizon is thick with masts that do not intend to leave. This is the arrival of the great heathen army, a coalition of Norse warriors, brothers and kings, bound together not just by a hunger for silver, but by a desire for land, for soil they can call their own, and perhaps, as the sagas suggest, for a vengeance that would reshape the map of Britain forever. Unlike the fragmented warbands of the past, this great host moves with a terrifying, calculated grace. They do not merely strike and retreat, they winter in the heart of the English kingdoms, turning monasteries into fortresses and meadows into sprawling camps. Their tactical brilliance lies in their mobility, a mastery of the river systems that allow them to strike deep inland, appearing where they are least expected. their horses stolen from the local countryside to give them a speed that the slow-moving Fjord of the English cannot match. They move like a slow-moving tide, flowing around obstacles and pooling in the fertile valleys, their presence a constant low thrum of tension that settles over the thatched roofs and stone churches of Northumbria, East Anglia and Mercia. Imagine the quiet of an English autumn morning, the air crisp and smelling of wood smoke and damp earth. In the distance the low rhythmic beat of a drum begins, a sound that vibrates in the chest before it is heard by the ear. This is the sound of a new world arriving. One by one, the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdoms begin to buckle under the pressure of this relentless northern wind. York falls to the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, its Roman walls repaired and reinforced by Norse hands. The kings of the old ways find their crowns heavy and their borders shrinking as the great army settles into the landscape, not as guests, but as masters of the plough and the sword alike. Yet, as the years drift by like the falling leaves of the great forest, the relentless expansion meets a singular, stubborn resistance in the marshes of Somerset. There, amidst the reeds and the hidden pathways of Athelney, King Alfred of Wessex gathers the remnants of his people, waiting, watching, and learning the ways of his enemy. The conflict eventually reaches its peak at the Battle of Edington, a clash of shields and iron that leaves both sides weary of the constant shedding of blood. And so, in the quiet aftermath of the struggle, a different kind of victory is sought, one born of parchment and ink rather than steel. The Treaty of Wedmore, signed between Alfred and the Norse leader Guthrum, creates a line across the heart of England, a boundary that stretches from the Thames up toward the old Roman road of Watling Street. To the east and north lies the Danelaw, a vast territory where the laws of the Northmen hold sway, where the customs of Scandinavia take root in British soil. This is a moment of profound transformation, a settling of the stormy seas. Guthrum accepts baptism, and for a moment, the clashing of faiths finds a peaceful middle ground, a space where the hammer of Thor and the cross of the White Christ begin to exist in the same quiet villages, carved onto the same stone monuments. As the decades pass, the line of the Danelaw begins to blur, not through further conquest, but through the gentle, persistent blending of daily life. In the markets of Jorvik, the city we now call York, the air is filled with a new kind of music, a tapestry of sound woven from two languages that find they have much to say to one another. The Old Norse of the settlers and the Old English of the locals are cousins, separated by time and sea, but now reunited in the common language of trade and farming. You can hear it still today in the way we speak of the sky, the wind, and the stars.
Words like husband, window, and fellow are the quiet echoes of this ancient meeting, gifts left behind by the men of the North who decided to stay and watch the English seasons turn. The landscape itself begins to change, reflecting this new, hybrid identity. In the Danelaw, the fields are divided differently, and the names of the towns begin to carry the suffix of by, meaning a farm or a settlement, or thorp, meaning a hamlet. Places like Derby, Whitby, and Scunthorpe become anchors in a shifting world, quiet reminders that the fierce warriors of the sagas were also builders, dreamers, and fathers. They brought with them their love for the law and the thing, the assembly where disputes were settled through words rather than blades, introducing a sense of communal justice that would eventually seep into the very foundations of English society. In the long blue twilights of the northern counties, the blending of customs becomes almost seamless. A Norse farmer might offer a sacrifice for a good harvest while his neighbour kneels in a stone chapel, yet they share the same soil, the same weather, and the same hopes for their children. The intricate, swirling patterns of Norse art, the serpents and beasts that twist in eternal dances, begin to appear on the stone crosses of English churchyards,
a beautiful, tangled union of two worlds that once seemed irreconcilable. The fierce energy of the Viking age is being channeled into the earth, into the slow, rhythmic labor of the plough and the steady growth of the grain. The great heathen army did not just conquer, it planted seeds. It brought a vitality and a different perspective on the world, a sense of seafaring adventure and a rugged independence that merged with the deep-rooted traditions of the English landscape. As the fires burn low in the hearths of these new Anglo-Norse homesteads, the stories told to the children are a mixture of the old gods and the new saints, of voyages across the grey waves and the quiet sanctity of the hidden valley. The swords are hung above the mantles, gathering dust as they are replaced by the tools of the craftsman and the merchant. And so, the Danelaw becomes more than just a political boundary. It becomes a cradle for a new kind of culture, a place where the North Sea is no longer a barrier, but a bridge. The fierce heat of the invasion has cooled into the steady warmth of a shared life. As the stars wheel over the quiet fields of Lincolnshire and the rugged dales of Yorkshire, the legacy of the great army lives on in the very cadence of the local speech, in the shape of the stone walls, and in the enduring spirit of a people who learned to find peace in the blending of their different histories. The saga of the North Sea continues, not in the roar of the raid, but in the quiet, steady breath of a land that has found its balance, waiting for the next chapter to be written in the soft light of the rising moon. The borders may shift and the kings may fall, but the roots of the Danelaw have grown deep, weaving themselves into the very fabric of the earth, a silent testament to the time when the Vikings stopped being strangers and became, at last, a part of the home they had travelled so far to find. Imagine, for a moment, the sound of a wooden hull sliding not over salt spray, but through the soft, yielding reeds of a riverbank at dawn. While some of the Northmen were turning their gaze toward the emerald fields of England and the misty coasts of France, others looked toward the sunrise, drawn by a different kind of siren song, a whisper of silver and silk that echoed from the deep interior of the east. These were the Rus, men of the oars and the helm who saw the great rivers of the continent not as barriers, but as liquid highways, stretching into a vast, unknown horizon. They did not seek the sudden shock of the coastal raid, but rather the slow, rhythmic pulse of the long-haul journey, navigating the winding veins of the earth that led toward the legendary riches of the Orient. The journey begins in the cool, clear waters of the Baltic, where the ships turn their prows into the mouths of the Neva and the Volkhov. These are not the heavy, deep-keeled dragon ships of the Atlantic, but lighter, more agile vessels, boats that can be hauled over land when the water grows shallow or the rapids become too fierce. As the sun filters through the dense canopies of birch and pine, the air carries the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The rowers pull in a steady, meditative rhythm, their oars dipping into the dark water with a soft, repetitive splash that lulls the mind into a state of quiet focus. Here, in the deep forests, the Rus found a wealth that did not glitter like gold, but was just as precious. The thick velvet pelts of sable and fox, and the golden translucent tears of amber gathered from the northern shores. As the years passed, these travellers began to weave themselves into the landscape, building fortified trading posts that would eventually blossom into the great heart of the Kievan Rus. They settled in places like Novgorod and Kiev, high on the bluffs overlooking the Dnieper River, where the view stretches out across the endless steppe like a sea of grass. In these bustling markets, the rough, salt-worn culture of the north met the intricate, colourful traditions of the Slavic and steppe peoples. It was a world of slow, deliberate exchange, a place where a handful of amber beads might be traded for a length of shimmering silk, or a bundle of furs for a pouch of silver coins minted in distant lands. The life of the river trader was one of patience and endurance, a long winding path that required a keen eye for the currents and a steady hand on the tiller. The most daring of these voyagers followed the Dnieper all the way to the south, toward the Black Sea, facing the terrifying beauty of the great rapids. To navigate these stretches, the crews had to disembark and carry their ships on their shoulders, walking miles through the wilderness while keeping a watchful eye on the forest's edge. It was a test of strength and spirit, a shared labor that forged a bond between the men and the river, but the reward for this hardship was a sight that must have seemed like a fever dream to a traveller from the cold, grey north. After weeks of rowing across the open sea, the horizon would begin to shimmer with the golden domes and white marble walls of Constantinople, the city the Vikings called Miklagard, the Great City. To the eyes of a Norseman, Constantinople was not merely a city, but a world unto itself. It was a labyrinth of stone and light, where the air was thick with the scent of incense, roasted spices, and the salt of the Marmara. The scale of the city was immense, its walls rising like mountains against the blue sky, its harbours crowded with ships from every corner of the known world. While the rest of Europe was often shrouded in the quiet simplicity of the early Middle Ages, Constantinople was a beacon of ancient knowledge and unimaginable luxury. The emperors sat upon thrones of gold, surrounded by mechanical lions that roared, and birds that sang in trees of silver, a display of power and artifice that left the Northmen breathless with wonder. It was here, in the shadow of the Hagia Sophia, that the most elite of the Norse warriors found their ultimate calling. The Byzantine emperors, wary of the shifting loyalties of their own kin, looked to the north for guards who were as loyal as they were fierce. Thus was born the Varangian Guard, a legendary brotherhood of Norsemen who became the personal protectors of the emperor himself. These men were the giants of the palace, clad in heavy mail and carrying the massive, long-handled Dane axes that had become their signature. They stood as silent sentinels at the gates of the inner sanctum, their presence a guarantee of stability in a world of complex courtly intrigue. Life in the Varangian Guard was a strange and prestigious existence. A young man from a small fjord in Norway might find himself standing watch in a hall of porphyry and gold, his breath hitching as he looked upon mosaics that seemed to glow with an inner light. They were paid in mountains of silver, more wealth than a chieftain back home could ever dream of possessing. But beyond the riches, there was a sense of belonging to something vast and eternal. They were the axe-bearing barbarians who held the fate of an empire in their hands, their names carved in runic graffiti on the marble balustrades of the great cathedral. A quiet, defiant mark of their presence in a city that felt like the center of the universe. As the seasons turned, many of these warriors eventually felt the pull of the north once more. They would return to their homelands, their ships heavy with eastern silver, their chests filled with silks, and their minds overflowing with stories of the Golden City. They brought with them more than just wealth. They brought new ideas, new fashions, and a wider understanding of the world's complexity. The path from the Baltic to the Black Sea had become a bridge between two worlds, a thread of silver and silk that tied the cold, rugged north to the warm, sophisticated heart of the east. The river journeys of the Rus were not just about trade or conquest. They were a testament to the Northman's restless curiosity and his ability to adapt to any environment. Whether they were hauling ships over the muddy portages of the Russian interior or standing guard in the sun-drenched courtyards of Byzantium, they moved with a quiet confidence, a belief that the world was a place to be explored, understood, and ultimately made their own. The steady beat of the oars on the Volga and the Dnieper echoed the heartbeat of a people who refused to be contained by the shores of their birth, pushing ever further into the unknown, guided by the stars and the silver light of the moon, reflecting off the water, And so, the Varangian path became a legacy of connection, a reminder that even in an age of great distances and slow travel, the world was woven together by the courage of those willing to follow the current. The amber of the north and the silk of the east met in the middle, creating a tapestry of culture that was richer and more vibrant than either could have been alone. As the night deepens and the world grows still, we can almost hear the distant, rhythmic splash of those oars, a soft, steady sound that carries us across the silent rivers of history, toward a horizon where the golden domes of the great city still glimmer in the twilight of our dreams. The journey continues, always moving, always flowing, as the shadows of the past blend seamlessly into the quiet peace of the present moment. The scent of salt spray lingers in the air, but the water beneath the hull begins to change, turning from the silt-heavy browns of the southern rivers to the deep, crystalline indigo of the North Atlantic. We are leaving the warmth of the hearth fires behind, following the wake of the longships as they push further into the unknown, where the ocean meets the sky in a seamless blur of grey and silver. It is here, amidst the crashing whitecaps and the haunting cry of the storm petrel, that the story of the Northman takes its most daring turn, venturing into a realm where the world was thought to simply end. As the 9th century draws to a close, a new horizon emerges from the mist, a rugged island of black volcanic rock and emerald moss that we now call Iceland. For the Norsemen who first sighted these shores, it was more than just land. It was a sanctuary of silence, a place where the reach of kings could not follow them. They came not as raiders, but as settlers, carrying with them their livestock, their families, and the heavy iron pots of their ancestors. They found a landscape of breathtaking contradictions, where rivers of molten fire flowed beneath glaciers of ancient ice, and steam rose from the earth in ghostly plumes that danced in the freezing wind. In this wild, untamed beauty, they established the Althing, one of the oldest parliaments in the world, meeting beneath the towering cliffs of Thingvellir to settle disputes and recite the laws that bound them together. But perhaps the greatest treasure they brought to these lonely shores was not gold or silver, but the power of memory. In the long dark winters, when the sun barely grazed the horizon and the snow drifted high against the turf walls of their longhouses, the settlers turned to the art of the spoken word. They gathered around the central fire, the smell of peat smoke and roasted meat filling the room, and listened as the skalds wove the intricate tapestries of the sagas. These were not merely stories, they were the living history of a people, preserved through generations by the rhythmic pulse of alliteration and the steady beat of the heart. Because of the isolation of Iceland, these tales remained remarkably pure, eventually being etched onto parchment to tell of gods and heroes, of blood feuds and voyages, ensuring that the voices of the Viking age would echo down through the centuries, long after the last longship had rotted into the earth. As the years passed and the coastal valleys of Iceland grew crowded with sheep and smoke, the spirit of the wanderer stirred once more. Among these restless souls was a man of fiery temperament and even fiercer ambition, known to history as Eric the Red. Banished from Iceland for a period of 3 years, Eric refused to let his spirit be broken by exile. Instead, he turned his prow westward, chasing rumours of a land that lay hidden behind the fog. What he found was a vast, frozen expanse of jagged peaks and deep, winding fjords, a land he named Greenland, with a hope that a fair name might entice others to follow him. It was a testament to the sheer resilience of the human spirit that Eric and his followers managed to carve a life out of this unforgiving wilderness. They built stone houses with walls thick enough to withstand the howling gales, and they lived on the edge of the world, hunting walrus for their valuable ivory, and tending to small herds of hardy cattle in the brief, flickering warmth of the summer months. In the stillness of the Greenland night, under the shimmering curtains of the aurora borealis, they were the furthest outpost of European civilization, a lonely light burning in the vast, cold dark. Yet even Greenland was not the final destination. The blood of the explorers flowed strong in the veins of Eric's son, Leif Erikson, a man described in the sagas as wise, considerate, and strong of stature. Around the year 1000, Leif set sail from the Greenland colonies, guided by the accounts of a merchant who had glimpsed land further to the west after being blown off course. The journey was a test of endurance and faith, as the small crew navigated the treacherous waters of the Labrador Sea, where icebergs the size of mountains drifted silently through the fog like ghosts of the deep. They first encountered a land of flat stones, which they called Helluland, and then a land of thick forests they named Markland. But it was the third landfall that would change the map of history forever. As they sailed further south, the air grew softer and the grass grew taller, and they found a place where the rivers were teeming with salmon larger than any they had ever seen. They stepped ashore onto a land of abundance, a place they called Vinland, for the wild grapes they found growing in the woods. Today, we know this place as Lance aux Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland. As we imagine Leif and his men standing on that rugged coastline, we can feel the weight of the moment. The first time the people of the East and the people of the West met across the vastness of the Atlantic. They built sod houses, the foundations of which can still be traced in the earth today, and they listened to the wind whispering through the pines, unaware that they had reached a continent that would remain a mystery to the rest of Europe for another 5 centuries. The settlement at Vinland was short-lived, perhaps only lasting a few years, as the distance from home and the tensions with the indigenous peoples proved too great to overcome. But the memory of that voyage never truly faded. It lived on in the oral traditions, a shimmering dream of a golden land across the water, a place of timber and grapes and endless possibility. As we drift further into the quiet of the night, we can see the embers of those ancient fires glowing in the dark, marking the path of a people who were never content to stay behind the safety of the horizon. The North Sea was not a barrier to them, but a bridge, a highway of waves that carried them to the very edges of the known world and beyond. The transition from the wild, windswept shores of the Americas back to the quiet hearths of the North is a gentle one, like the ebbing of a tide. We find ourselves once more in the presence of the great storytellers, the keepers of the sagas, who understood that every journey, no matter how far, eventually leads back to the soul. The legacy of the Vikings is not just one of iron and conquest, but of curiosity and the courage to face the unknown with eyes wide open. They taught us that the world is a vast and wondrous place, filled with hidden corners and untold stories, waiting for those brave enough to seek them out. As the rhythm of the waves slows and the stars begin to fade into the soft light of a new dawn, we feel a sense of profound peace. The great longships have found their moorings, the oars are stowed, and the sails are furled. The echoes of the North Sea, once loud with the sound of battle and discovery, have softened into a lullaby, a gentle reminder of the enduring power of the human spirit to find its way through the storm. The shadows of the past are long, but they are not cold. They are filled with the warmth of the fires that once burned in the longhouses of Iceland and the stone huts of Greenland. They are the same fires that burn within us today, the light of curiosity that keeps us moving forward, even in the quietest moments of our lives. The journey through the Viking Age is a journey through the very heart of what it means to be alive, to explore, to build, to remember, and finally, to rest. As we prepare to move into the final chapter of this story, let the weight of the history we have travelled settle comfortably around you, like a thick, woolen cloak against the evening chill. The world is large, and its stories are many, but for now there is only the steady breath of the ocean and the soft, rhythmic pulse of time itself,
carrying us toward a place of deep and lasting stillness. The sagas are nearly told, the voyages are nearly complete, and the horizon is finally at rest. The sound of a heavy iron bell rings out across a fjord, its deep, resonant tolling vibrating through the damp morning mist and replacing the rhythmic thud of the shipbuilder's axe. It is a new sound, one that carries a different weight than the clatter of shields or the splashing of oars, signaling a slow and profound transformation in the rhythm of the north. As the 11th century unfolds, the fierce, jagged edges of the Viking world begin to soften, smoothed over by the steady, persistent tide of a new faith. The old gods, Odin with his single searching eye and Thor with his thunderous hammer, do not vanish overnight, but they begin to recede into the shadows of the deep woods and the high, lonely crags, making room for the quiet stone churches rising in the valleys. This shift is not merely one of prayer, but of the very soul of the culture. The warrior ethos, once defined by the pursuit of individual glory and the restless need for expansion, begins to settle into the structured life of kingdoms and crowns. The great halls, once filled with the boastful songs of skalds recounting bloody raids, now listen to the measured chants of monks and the rustle of parchment. There is a newfound stillness in the air, a sense that the horizon is no longer a boundary to be crossed with fire and steel, but a border to be guarded and governed. The fierce independence of the sea kings is gradually traded for the stability of a settled life, as the wild energy of the Viking Age is channeled into the foundations of the Scandinavian nations we recognize today. As the years pass, the longships grow fewer, and the trade routes that once pulsed with the chaotic energy of explorers become the steady veins of a more predictable commerce. The world is becoming smaller, more mapped, and the vast, terrifying mysteries of the North Sea are being replaced by the mundane realities of law and land. Yet even as the old ways fade, history prepares one final, thunderous echo of the era that was. In the year 1066, the air in the north of England carries a sharp, metallic chill. It is the month of September, and the fields near a small bridge called Stamford are heavy with the scent of damp earth and late summer grass. Here, the last great Viking king, Harald Hardrada, a man whose very name means hard ruler, and whose life was a tapestry of battles from Byzantium to Norway, stands ready for one final gamble. He is a giant of a man, a living relic of a vanishing world, representing the final flickering flame of the Viking spirit. The battle that follows is a chaotic, desperate struggle, a clash of iron and will that marks the definitive closing of a door. When the sun sets over the bloody banks of the Derwent River, the Viking threat to England is extinguished forever. The age of the sea voyagers, the pillagers of monasteries, and the founders of distant colonies reaches its symbolic end on that bridge. It is a quiet realization that settles over the landscape, the realization that the time of the Northmen as a singular, unstoppable force has passed into the realm of memory. But as you lie here, drifting in the quiet spaces between then and now, you might realize that the Vikings never truly left us. Their departure was not a disappearance, but a blending, a slow dissolving into the very fabric of the world they once traversed. Their legacy is not found in ruins alone, but in the living breath of our modern existence. It is hidden in the words we speak every day, simple, sturdy words like sky, window, husband, and Thursday, which carry the DNA of the Old Norse tongue across 1,000 years of conversation. The laws they established in the Danelaw and in the parliaments of Iceland, the Althing, laid the groundwork for the concepts of justice and communal governance that still shape our societies. They were a people who understood the balance between the rights of the individual and the needs of the community, a balance that remains as delicate and vital today as it was in the shadow of a turf-roofed longhouse. Their imagination, too, remains a permanent fixture in our collective mind.
We see their shadows in our stories of dragons and heroes, in our fascination with the rugged beauty of the wilderness, and in that restless human urge to see what lies just beyond the next headland.
The Viking Age was a time of immense movement and profound change, a period when the world was stretched and pulled into new shapes by the strength of a few thousand men and women in wooden boats. It was a time of fire and ice, of great cruelty and breathtaking discovery. But above all, it was a human story. It was the story of people who looked at the vast, grey expanse of the North Sea and did not see a barrier, but a path. Now the path has led us home. The longships are pulled high onto the shore, their hulls drying in the cool evening air. The oars are laid to rest, and the sails are folded away, smelling of salt and old adventures. The great fires in the hearths are burning low, turning into glowing embers that cast long, soft shadows against the timber walls. There is no more need for the watchman's cry or the navigator's star. The world is at peace, and the sagas have reached their final, quiet stanza. Feel the weight of your limbs as they sink deeper into the softness beneath you, much like the heavy anchors settling into the sandy floor of a sheltered cove. The cold winds of the North Atlantic are far away now, muffled by the warmth of the present moment. The stories of the North Sea, the voyages to Vinland, the markets of Miklagard, the fierce beauty of the fjords are all gathered here, tucked safely into the corners of your mind to be revisited in dreams. As the silence deepens, imagine the steady, rhythmic wash of the tide against a pebbled beach, a sound that has not changed since the first Norseman pushed his boat into the surf. It is a timeless sound, a lullaby of the earth itself, reminding us that while eras may end and kings may fall, the world remains steady and enduring. The Viking Age has set like a pale sun dropping below the waves, leaving behind a long, glowing twilight that illuminates the path to sleep. The north is quiet, the seas are calm, the stars are fixed in their places, watching over a world that is finally, beautifully still. There is nothing left to do but drift, to let the current of your breath carry you away from the shores of history and into the deep, dark waters of rest. The sagas are finished. The journey is complete. You are safe, you are warm, and the horizon is at rest. Sleep now, as the echoes of the north fade into the softest whisper, and the ocean of time carries you gently into the night.